The night air was thick with the sound of high-energy music, laughter, and the unmistakable buzz of power that permeated the luxurious mansion in the heart of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was a party unlike any other where business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities mingled under the dazzling lights, their conversations hidden beneath the polished surface of expensive champagne flutes and hush deals. Tonight's event, however, was more than just a gathering of the city's elite. It was a front. Behind the grand facade of wealth and indulgence, something far more sinister was taking place. Whispers had spread about the host, a powerful businessman named Victor Carlyle. While publicly known as a philanthropist and influential figure in the business world, Carlyle's was under secret investigation for his involvement in various illegal activities, including money laundering and drug trafficking. And tonight's event, it was believed to be a perfect cover for moving large sums of dirty money and possibly making high-stakes deals with underworld figures. Yet few guests were aware of the true nature of the night. They were too caught up in the spectacle, the flashing lights, the models, the flowing drinks, and the feel of being untouchable for just a few hours. But one guest was there for a completely different reason. Angela Davis, recently appointed chief of police, stood quietly near one of the side balconies, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Unlike many of the other guests, Angela didn't belong here socially, nor was she a willing participant in the extravagance around her. She was here on a mission. Tonight was supposed to be a routine operation to observe and gather critical information before officially shutting the event down. Angela wasn't the type to sit back and watch things unfold from a distance. She had worked her way through the ranks, proving herself time and again in some of the most challenging situations the police department had ever faced. As one of the first black women to hold the position of chief in this city, she knew she had to be twice as vigilant, twice as sharp, and twice as effective. Every move she made was under scrutiny, and tonight's operation had personal stakes for her as well. The very network of corruption she was investigating had played a role in derailing the career of her former mentor, a well-respected captain who had been ousted after a failed sting operation on Carlyle's associates. Angela had sworn to clean up the department and the city, no matter what it took. But tonight, she was alone. No backup, no official police presence. She didn't want to tip off Carlyle or anyone in his circle. Instead, she blended into the crowd, wearing a simple yet elegant black dress that allowed her to move unnoticed through the opulent surroundings. Her goal was to observe the key players, gather intel, and only intervene when the time was right. She'd shut down the party officially, but first, she needed to confirm the rumors. The atmosphere inside the mansion was charged, almost electric. Angela moved through the grand halls, noting the subtle exchanges between high-profile guests. Men in tailored suits exchanged briefcases with an air of secrecy. Women in designer gowns whispered into each other's ears, their eyes flickering towards Carlyle's private office, where the real deals were being made behind closed doors. Angela knew it wouldn't be long before something illegal was set into motion. But amidst the glamour and pretension, there was an underlying tension that Angela could feel in her bones. It wasn't just the risk of being caught by the criminal she was investigating, it was the knowledge that she wasn't entirely safe, even here. Her rise to chief of police had not been met without opposition, and there were plenty of people, even within her own department, who wouldn't mind seeing her fail. It was a tightrope she walked every day, balancing between the justice she sought and the resistance from those who preferred the status quo. Angela paused by a massive marble pillar near the entrance to the ballroom, her eyes narrowing as she noticed two figures who seemed out of place. Two uniformed officers, Officers Blake and Jackson, had just entered the mansion. It was strange to see them here, especially since Angela hadn't requested any backup or sent out any orders for officers to patrol the event. She didn't recognize them immediately, were relatively new to the department since she'd been appointed chief, but she could feel the unease emanating from them. Blake, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, immediately caught sight of Angela. His gaze lingered on her a bit too long, his expression shifting into one of suspicion. Beside him, Jackson, who seemed more reserved and unsure, followed his partner's lead, but there was something in his body language that suggested hesitation. Angela could tell that this wasn't going to be a simple situation. From across the room, she could see Blake muttering something to Jackson before making his way directly toward her. His stance was authoritative, almost aggressive, as if he had already made up his mind about who she was. Angela braced herself, knowing that this interaction was about to escalate. She had dealt with officers like Blake before, men who assumed they knew everything about a person based on skin color, attire, or demeanor. "Mom, can I have a word with you?" Blake's voice was firm, with just enough edge to suggest he wasn't really asking. Angela could hear the unspoken judgment behind his words. She kept her expression neutral, knowing that reacting too soon could only make things worse. "Of course, officer," Angela replied smoothly. "What seems to be the issue?" Blake's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning her face as if searching for a reason to accuse her of something. "We've had reports of suspicious activity at this event, and you don't exactly look like you belong here. Can I see some identification?" Angela's patience was beginning to thin, but she remained calm. She knew this moment was critical. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said carefully, not revealing her position just yet. Blake's jaw tightened. He was growing impatient. "I'm not asking, Mom. ID. Now." Angela knew that she could easily diffuse the situation by revealing her badge and rank, but something inside her stopped her. She wanted to see how far Blake was willing to go with this. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the deeper issues in the department, the prejudices and assumptions that were allowed to flourish unchecked. So she held back, studying his reaction, watching as his frustration grew. Officer Jackson shifted nervously beside Blake. He glanced at Angela, then back at his partner. There was something uncertain in his gaze, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction this was taking. But he stayed silent, unwilling or unable to question Blake's authority. The tension between them was palpable, and Angela could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew that whatever happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. Would Blake escalate the situation, driven by his own biases and assumptions? Or would Jackson step in and diffuse it before it spiraled out of control? Angela waited, poised and ready, her heart steady, her mind sharp. She knew the game they were playing, and she was prepared for whatever came next. The mood in the room shifted as Officer Blake took another step forward, his hand casually resting on the holster of his gun, a silent but unmistakable threat. Angela kept her composure, though she could sense the dangerous edge in Blake's demeanor. He wasn't here to simply ask questions or do a routine check. This was about power and control, and Angela could feel that he was more than willing to push her to see how far he could go. "Mom, I'm not going to ask again. You either show me your ID, or I'm going to have to assume you're involved in whatever illegal activities are going on here," Blake said, his tone sharper now, bordering on condescension. His eyes swept over her in a way that made it clear he didn't believe she had any legitimate reason to be at such a high-profile event. Angela knew that if she presented her badge now, the situation could de-escalate quickly, but that wasn't what she wanted. This was her opportunity to see how the officers, especially Blake, handled themselves under pressure and more importantly, how far their implicit biases would take them. She wasn't here to teach lessons on professionalism, but this moment had become a perfect example of why reform in the department was necessary. Before Angela could respond, Jackson, who had been silent until now, took a tentative step forward. His eyes flicked between Blake and Angela, and it was clear that he was uncomfortable. "Blake, maybe we should just call this in. We don't even know who she is yet," Jackson suggested, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. Blake shot him a glance, irritation flashing across his face. "We don't need to call anything in, Jackson. I can handle this." His words came out sharp and dismissive, leaving no room for discussion. Angela studied Jackson for a moment. There was something in his body language that suggested he wasn't entirely on board with Blake's aggressive approach. His hand hovered near his belt, not quite at his gun, but the tension was there, ready to snap into action if Blake escalated things further. Jackson, despite his uncertainty, remained passive, unwilling to challenge his partner's authority directly. Angela recognized that Jackson was still new, possibly eager to avoid confrontation with his more dominant colleague, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson could be reasoned with, but Blake, it was a different story. Blake took another step toward her, his voice dropping to a lower, more menacing tone. "I'm not going to say it again. You either hand over your ID or I'll arrest you for obstruction. Your choice." Angela let out a slow breath, her mind working through the options in front of her. She could shut this down quickly, pull out her badge, and let them eat their words. But she wasn't ready to give in just yet. She needed to see where this was going, how far Blake would push, and whether Jackson would intervene before things spiraled out of control. "I think you're making a mistake, officer," Angela said, her voice calm and steady. "You should really think about what you're doing." Blake's face darkened, his patience clearly running thin. "I don't need advice from someone like you," he snapped. "Turn around, put your hands behind your back. You're under unrest." Angela's expression didn't change, but inside, she could feel the shift. Blake was going all in now, making the assumption that she was guilty of something simply because of her presence at the party. She had known officers like him before, men who relied on their gut instincts, even when those instincts were clouded by prejudice. "Blake, maybe we should," Jackson started, but Blake cut him off with a sharp look. "Stay out of this, Jackson. I've got it under control." Angela slowly raised her hands, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to give Jackson one last chance to act. The ball was in his court now. Would he stand by while his partner made a monumental mistake, or would he step up and prevent things from getting worse? But Jackson hesitated, his gaze shifting from Blake to Angela and back again. His lips parted as if he was about to speak, but no words came out. Blake took that as his cue to move in. He grabbed Angela's wrist roughly, his fingers digging into her skin as he spun her around to cuff her. And that's when Angela finally spoke. "Check your radio," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It wasn't a command or a plea, it was a simple statement of fact. Blake hesitated for just a second, his grip tightening as if he didn't trust what he had heard. "What did you say?" "I said, check your radio," Angela repeated, her tone still calm, unflinching. Blake's confusion was evident. He shot a glance at Jackson, who shrugged, equally unsure of what she meant. But something in Angela's confidence unsettled Blake. He reached for his radio, pressing the button to call dispatch. "This is Officer Blake. We're at the Carlisle residence. We've detained a suspect," he said, his voice full of authority. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the dispatcher responded. Unit 12, can you confirm the identity of the suspect? Over. Blake frowned, glancing at Angela. Suspect refuses to provide ID. We're bringing her in. There was another pause, longer this time, before the dispatcher came back, their voice tense and urgent. Unit 12, be advised that Chief Davis is on site undercover. Do not detain anyone without further confirmation. Repeat, Chief Davis is on site. Over. The color drained from Blake's face as the words sank in. His hand, still gripping Angela's wrist, suddenly loosened as his brain scrambled to process the information. He glanced at Jackson, whose eyes were wide with realization. "Chief Davis?" Jackson whispered, barely able to form the words. Blake stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He had been about to arrest his own boss, the chief of police, in front of half the city's elite. Angela turned around slowly, meeting Blake's stunned gaze with a calm that only deepened his sense of dread. She didn't say a word, didn't need to. The look on her face was enough to drive the point home. For a moment, the room seemed to stand still. The music from the party continued to pulse in the background, but for Blake and Jackson, it was as if the world had stopped. "So, Mom," Blake started, but Angela raised a hand to silence him. "I gave you several chances to reconsider your actions," she said quietly, "and each time you chose to ignore me. You made assumptions and now you're going to have to deal with the consequences of those assumptions." Blake's face was pale, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. Jackson, standing beside him, looked equally horrified, though Angela could see the guilt already settling into his features. Unlike Blake, Jackson hadn't driven the situation, he had simply followed. But following was no excuse. Angela stepped forward, still calm, still composed. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice steady. "Being an officer of the law means more than just enforcing rules. It means knowing when to question your own biases, when to recognize that not everyone fits into your narrow view of the world." Blake looked as though he might collapse under the weight of his own shame, but Angela didn't wait for his apology. She had seen enough. She turned to leave, ready to take control of the situation and shut down the party as planned, but she knew this was far from over. The night had only just begun. Blake stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his radio, as if waiting for the last few moments to rewind themselves, to undo the colossal mistake that had just unfolded in front of him. The reality of the situation was sinking in, heavy and suffocating. Chief Angela Davis, had just been cuffed, restrained by her own officers, based entirely on Blake's biases and rash judgment. Jackson, standing slightly behind, looked like a man caught in the middle of a slow-moving disaster, unable to act but fully aware of the impending fallout. His face was pale, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The air between the three of them felt thick, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. Angela didn't flinch. Her calm was both unnerving and powerful, the silence speaking louder than any reprimand could. She took a slow breath, then turned her gaze directly at Blake, piercing through the fog of panic that had clouded his judgment. "What you just did," Angela said, her voice low but filled with authority, "was beyond unprofessional. It was reckless, driven by your assumptions, and I told you multiple times to reconsider." Blake swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. His fingers twitched, wanting to undo the handcuffs that were still clasped around Angela's wrists, but he hesitated, unsure of how to even begin rectifying the situation. "Mom, I didn't realize," Blake started, his voice faltering as he struggled to find the right words. Angela raised an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. Didn't realize what? That you were about to arrest the chief of police? Or that you were so blinded by your assumptions that you couldn't even take a second to think before acting? Jackson shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Blake and Angela. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every second that passed felt like another nail in the coffin of their careers. But Angela wasn't done. Her calmness was deceptive, the calm before the storm that Blake knew was about to break. "Remove the handcuffs," she ordered, her voice firm but controlled. Blake fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. The cold metal fell away from Angela's wrists, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Angela massaged her wrists briefly, not in pain, but as a quiet reminder of the humiliation she had just endured at the hands of her own officers. Blake took a step back, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being in this position, being the one who made a mistake, the one on the defensive. He had always prided himself on being decisive, on taking control of situations, but now he felt exposed, vulnerable. He could feel Jackson's eyes on him, and for a brief moment, Blake felt the sting of doubt. Had he really gone too far this time? Was his instinct, the very thing he had relied on his entire career, actually betraying him? Angela stood before him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She wasn't going to let this slide, and Blake knew it. But the real question gnawed at him: why hadn't she stopped it sooner? Why had she let it get this far? "I tried to warn you," Angela said, almost as if reading his thoughts. "But you were too busy acting on your assumptions to listen." Blake clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. I thought you were." "What? A threat? A criminal?" Angela's voice cut through his stammering like a knife. "Tell me, Blake, what exactly made you so sure I didn't belong here?" Blake's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. His mind raced back over the last few minutes, trying to piece together his thought process, his rationale. But the harder he tried to justify his actions, the more hollow his reasoning felt. It wasn't about logic, it had never been. It had been a gut reaction, an instinct, something he had never questioned before, until now. Jackson, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. "Blake, maybe we should just let her handle this." His voice was hesitant, but there was a quiet urgency to it. Blake shot him a look, but Jackson didn't back down. He knew they were already in deep, and if anyone could pull them out of the mess they'd created, it was Chief Davis herself. Jackson had seen enough in her eyes to know that she wasn't going to blow this up publicly, not yet, at least, but that didn't mean they were off the hook. Angela turned her attention to Jackson, her expression softening slightly, though it remained serious. "You had a chance to stop this," she said, her words directed at him now. "You knew something wasn't right, didn't you?" Jackson's throat tightened, but he nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted quietly. I didn't act." Why? Angela's question was simple, but it carried the weight of 1,000 implications. Jackson hesitated, glancing at Blake out of the corner of his eye. "I didn't want to undermine my partner," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela let the silence hang between them for a moment before responding. "And that's the problem, Jackson. You let loyalty to your partner outweigh your duty to the law and to the people you're supposed to serve." Jackson looked as though he might crumble under the weight of her words, but he remained standing, his face flushed with guilt. Blake's frustration was building. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of this kind of dressing down, especially not from someone like Angela. He had always been in control, always been the one calling the shots. But now, standing in front of the woman he had just tried to arrest, his boss, he felt the controls slipping through his fingers like sand. "Look," Blake said, his voice rough with the effort to maintain some semblance of authority. "I made a mistake. But we still have a job to do here. This party is a front for something bigger, something dangerous. We can't just..." Angela's eyes flashed, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did by hiding behind this investigation." Blake flinched, the sharpness of her words hitting him harder than he expected. "You think I don't know what's happening here?" Angela continued, her voice low and fierce. "You think I came here for fun? I'm fully aware of what this party is, who's involved, and what's at stake. But instead of working together to take down the real criminals, you wasted valuable time and resources trying to arrest the wrong person because you couldn't see past your own prejudices." Blake's face burned with humiliation. He wanted to defend himself, to push back, but every argument that came to mind felt weak, flimsy in the face of Angela's unwavering truth. Jackson cleared his throat, his voice cautious. "Ma'am, what do you want us to do?" Angela looked at him, then at Blake, her eyes assessing the situation. For a moment, neither officer could read her expression, but then she sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "We still have a job to do," she said finally, her voice calmer now, though it carried the weight of authority. "But from this point on, you follow my lead. No more impulsive decisions, no more assumptions. Should we do this by the book?" Blake and Jackson nodded, both of them acutely aware that they were on thin ice. The weight of their mistake hung over them, and they knew that Angela had the power to destroy their careers with a single phone call. That instead she was giving them a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. Angela turned and began to walk back toward the main part of the mansion, her stride confident and sure. Blake and Jackson followed, their steps more hesitant, as if they were treading carefully through a minefield. As they re-entered the party, the atmosphere had shifted. The guests, still oblivious to the drama that had unfolded, continued to mingle, their laughter and conversations filling the air. But Angela wasn't focused on them anymore. Her eyes were scanning the room, searching for the real targets. "Victor Carlyle," Angela said quietly to Blake and Jackson, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "He's the one we're after, and if I'm not mistaken, he's making his move tonight." Blake's jaw tightened. He had heard of Carlyle and the department had. A slippery businessman with connections in all the wrong places, Carlyle had managed to evade every attempt to bring him down. But Angela was determined to change that. "Where do we start?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Angela didn't hesitate. "His office. That's where the real deals are going down. But we need to be smart about this. No more rushing in without a plan." Blake bristled at the implication, but he kept his mouth shut. He knew better than to push Angela any further, especially now. As they made their way through the mansion, Angela's mind was already working through the next steps. She hadn't anticipated the night playing out like this, but she was adaptable. She had to be. And now that Blake and Jackson were somewhat back under control, she could focus on the real task at hand, bringing down Carlyle and his operation. But deep down, Angela knew that this night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the air was palpable, and there was a growing sense of unease gnawing at her. Something was coming, something bigger than any of them could anticipate. And Angela Davis was ready for it. The mansion was a labyrinth of wealth and secrets. Angela led Blake and Jackson through the corridors with purpose, her mind running through the different scenarios that could unfold. She could feel the tension radiating from both officers behind her, especially Blake, whose ego had clearly taken a significant blow. Jackson, on the other hand, seemed quieter now, more reflective, though Angela couldn't be sure if it was guilt or fear driving his silence. The three of them reached a long hallway lined with expensive art and marble floors that echoed their every step. At the end of the hall was Carlyle's office, a large, imposing door that seemed out of place amidst the opulence. This was the heart of the operation, the place where deals were made and secrets were kept. Angela paused just before they reached the door, her instincts kicking in. Something felt off. The quiet tension in the air wasn't just from the confrontation with Blake. There was a palpable sense of danger that made her skin prickle. She glanced back at the two officers, her voice low but commanding. "Stay alert," she said, her eyes locking with theirs. "Whatever happens next, follow my lead. No more mistakes." Blake gave a stiff nod, clearly still smarting from his earlier step, but Jackson appeared more focused, his eyes scanning the surroundings with heightened awareness. Angela could see that the night had shaken him, perhaps enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about policing. Angela moved forward, placing her hand on the door's cold, brass handle. She pushed it open slowly, her body tense, ready for anything. The room on the other side was dimly lit, the glow from a few lamps casting long shadows across the walls. It was richly decorated, filled with antique furniture and dark wood paneling. At the center of the room stood a large oak desk, and behind it Victor Carlyle. Carlyle looked up as the door creaked open, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Angela and the two officers. He didn't seem surprised, though. In fact, he almost looked amused, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "Ah, Chief Davis," Carlyle said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair, fingers steepled in front of him. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Angela's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She stepped into the room fully, her eyes never leaving Carlyle's face. "I'm here to shut this down, Carlyle. You've had your fun, but it ends tonight." Carlyle's smile widened slightly, but there was something predatory behind it. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands, Angela? I know how the game is played, and I've been playing it a lot longer than you." Angela took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Blake and Jackson remained near the door, their hands resting on their holsters, but Angela didn't need them to act yet. She was in control. "This isn't a game," she said, her voice cold. "We know what's happening here. We have evidence of your involvement in money laundering, drug trafficking, and more. You can either cooperate, or things are going to get very difficult." Carlyle chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "Evidence. That's a bold claim, Chief. But we both know how these things work. You don't have anything solid on me. If you did, you wouldn't be here playing these mind games. You'd already have me in cuffs." Angela's eyes narrowed. He was right, of course. They didn't have all the evidence yet, but this night was meant to gather enough to finally bring him down. What Carlyle didn't know was how close they were to getting everything they needed. Just as she was about to respond, something shifted in the room. A subtle noise barely audible came from the far side of the office. Angela's eyes flicked to the shadows, her body going still. She saw the faint outline of movement, someone lurking just out of sight. Her hand moved instinctively toward her holstered weapon. "We're not alone," she said softly, her eyes still scanning the room. Blake and Jackson immediately tensed, their own hands moving to their guns. The air in the room thickened with tension. and Carlisle's smile faltered for just a second. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze darting toward the shadowed corner of the room. From the darkness stepped two men, both large and intimidating, their faces cold and unreadable. They were clearly Carlisle's enforcers, and they had been waiting for this exact moment. "Chief Davis," Carlisle said, his voice smooth as ever, though there was now an edge to it. "I think you've overstayed your welcome. My friends here will escort you out. I suggest you leave while you still can." Angela didn't move. Her heart was racing, but her expression remained calm, her body tense and ready for what was about to unfold. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when they were so close. "Do you really think this is going to end well for you?" Angela asked, her voice low and controlled. "You know as well as I do that we have officers outside. This house is surrounded. You're not walking away from this." Carlisle's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've always enjoyed your confidence, Chief, but tonight you're the one who's surrounded." It was then that Angela heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned slightly, enough to see that more men had entered the hallway, blocking their exit. They were trapped. Blake's hand gripped his gun tighter, his body tensing as if ready to draw. But Angela shot him a quick look, silently ordering him to hold off. This wasn't the time for a firefight, not yet. They needed to think, to find another way out. Jackson, standing closest to the door, shifted nervously. His eyes darted to Angela, waiting for her next move, but Angela could see the fear in his eyes. He was young, inexperienced, and not prepared for a situation like this, and yet he was standing his ground, waiting for her lead. Carlisle leaned back in his chair, watching them with a predator's gaze. "You have two choices, Chief. You can leave quietly, and this can all be forgotten. Or you can try to take me in, but I promise you, it won't end the way you think." Angela's mind raced. She knew that if they engaged now, things would escalate quickly, and not in their favor. Carlisle's men were armed, and while she trusted her own skills and to some extent, those of Blake and Jackson, she couldn't guarantee the outcome of a confrontation in such close quarters. She needed to buy time to think. But time was running out, and Carlisle knew it. "We're not going anywhere," Angela said finally, her voice firm. "You're going to stand down, and you're going to come with us." Carlisle's smile widened. "I don't think so, Chief." And then, without warning, one of Carlisle's men reached for his gun. The next few seconds were a blur. Angela's instincts kicked in immediately. She dropped low, pulling her weapon as she moved, firing a single shot that hit the man in the shoulder. Blake and Jackson reacted a split second later, both drawing their guns as the room erupted into chaos. The second man lunged toward Blake, but Blake fired, hitting him square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, but the noise had already drawn the attention of the men in the hallway. Gunfire rang out as they rushed into the room, bullets tearing through the air. Angela dove behind the large oak desk, her heart pounding as she fired two more shots toward the door. One of Carlisle's men went down, but more were coming. She could hear Blake shouting orders to Jackson, trying to keep them from being overrun, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Get down," Angela shouted, as more bullets whizzed past her head. Carlisle, meanwhile, had ducked behind his desk, his expression no longer amused. He hadn't expected Angela to fight back like this, and now the situation was spiraling out of control. "Enough," Carlisle shouted over the noise, but his men weren't listening. The gunfire continued, and Angela knew they wouldn't last much longer if this kept up. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Angela spotted something, a door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a bookshelf. an escape route. "Blake, Jackson," she called out, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "We need to move now." Blake glanced at her, his face grim, but he nodded. He fired one last shot before making a break for the door, Jackson close behind him. Angela followed, her heart racing as they sprinted across the room. Bullets ricocheted off the walls around them, but they made it to the door, bursting through it just as more of Carlyle's men stormed the office. They were in a narrow hallway now, the noise of the fight fading behind them as they ran. Angela's mind was racing. She knew this wasn't over. Carlyle wouldn't let them go so easily. But for now, they had to regroup, to find a way out of this nightmare. As they ran down the hallway, Angela's mind turned over the possibilities. Carlyle had just shown his hand, but she still didn't have everything she needed to bring him down. They needed more evidence, more proof of his operations. But with the mansion now on high alert, it was going to be nearly impossible to get what they came for. "Where are we going?" Jackson panted, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they ran. "There's a safe room," Angela said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "Carlyle has one. I saw the plans for this mansion months ago." Blake shot her a look. "How do you know that?" Angela didn't answer right away, her focus on the task at hand. She had been preparing for this night for a long time, gathering intel, studying Carlyle's operations. She had known that one day it would come to this, a direct confrontation, but she hadn't expected it to go down quite like this. "Just trust me," she said finally. "We'll regroup, and then we'll figure out our next move." They turned a corner, the narrow hallway opening up into a larger, more open space. But before they could take another step, Angela froze, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something ahead. More of Carlyle's men. "Get back," she hissed, pulling Blake and Jackson behind a large pillar just as the men spotted them. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, and Angela knew they were running out of options. They needed a plan, and fast. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, an unexpected figure stepped out from the shadows, a man who, by all appearances, should have been one of Carlyle's guards. But the look on his face told a different story. He wasn't there to fight them. He was there to help. Angela's eyes darted between the approaching group of Carlyle's men and the unexpected figure who had stepped out of the shadows. There was something about him, his posture, the way he stood apart from the other enforcers, and the quick, subtle signal he flashed her way that made her hesitate before reaching for her gun. This man wasn't moving toward her with the same hostility as the others. He was signaling something, and Angela's instincts, honed from years in the field, told her to hold off on immediate action. Blake, however, didn't share her instincts. His hand was already on his weapon, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. "Chief, we need to neutralize them now before they corner us." Angela shot Blake a hard look. "Hold your fire," she commanded quietly but firmly. Her eyes were fixed on the man approaching them. "Something's off. Let me handle this." Blake's jaw tightened in frustration, but he held back, his eyes flashing with impatience. Jackson, standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze bouncing between the advancing men and Angela, unsure of what was about to unfold. The man leading the group stopped a few feet away from Angela, his eyes scanning the area to make sure none of Carlyle's other men were within earshot. Then he took a slow step forward, raising his hands slightly, palms open, a universal signal that he wasn't here to fight. "Chief Davis," the man said quietly, his voice low but calm, "you're running out of time. Carlyle's sending more men after you, but there's still a way out if you trust me." Angela didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing, calculating the risks. This could easily be a trap. Carlyle was known for his games, his psychological tactics to manipulate those who went against him. But something about this man felt different. His eyes held none of the cold, calculated malice she had seen in Carlyle's other enforcers. Instead, there was a flicker of something else: determination, desperation. "And why should I trust you?" Angela asked, her voice cool and measured, but not dismissive. The man glanced behind him, checking the hallway again before lowering his voice further. "'Cause I'm not one of them. I've been working undercover for months, trying to gather enough evidence to bring Carlyle down. I didn't expect you to come in tonight, but now that you're here, we need to move quickly before things get worse." Blake took a step forward, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "This sounds like a setup, Chief. We can't trust anything this guy says." Angela held up her hand, signaling Blake to stop. She focused entirely on the man in front of her. "You've been working undercover? For whom?" "For a federal task force," he replied, glancing briefly at Blake and Jackson before returning his focus to Angela. "Carlyle's operation has been under investigation for over a year. We've been monitoring his drug trafficking, arms deals and money laundering schemes. But he's slippery, and we haven't had the opportunity to gather enough hard evidence to take him down until now. Tonight was supposed to be the night I moved in to secure that evidence, but your arrival threw off the plan." Angela's mind worked quickly, processing the information. It explained the unease she had felt earlier, the sense that something bigger was at play. If this man was telling the truth, his presence could be the key to bringing Carlyle down. But there was still one glaring problem. "If you're undercover for the feds," Angela said slowly, her eyes locking onto his, "why haven't I heard about this? I'm the chief of police. No federal operation happens in my city without my knowledge." The man exhaled, tension rippling through his posture. "It's a covert op. Deep cover. Carlyle's has ties within law enforcement, both locally and at the state level. We couldn't risk anyone tipping him off, which means we've had to keep the circle of information as tight as possible. But now we don't have time for red tape. If we don't move fast, Carlyle's going to disappear and you're not going to make it out of this mansion alive." Angela considered his words carefully. It made sense, especially given Carlyle's ability to evade law enforcement for years. Corruption ran deep, and Angela was no stranger to how easily even good cops could be bought or intimidated into silence. But this also meant that if the federal agent was telling the truth, then she was walking straight into a war zone without realizing it. "What's your name?" Angela asked, her tone sharp, demanding confirmation. "Agent Marcus Rise," the man replied without hesitation. He reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a small, hidden badge that he flashed just long enough for Angela to see the federal credentials. Blake's frustration finally boiled over. "Chief, this is bullshit. We're supposed to believe some random guy with a badge just waltzes in and expects us to trust him. We need to take control of this situation before Carlyle sends the rest of his men to wipe us out." Angela ignored Blake's outburst, her attention fully on Reyes. "Where's the evidence you're talking about?" Reyes glanced around the corner, his expression tense. "Carlyle has a secure server in a hidden room beneath this mansion. That's where he keeps all his transaction records, payments, shipments, everything. We get to that, and we have him dead to rights." Angela's pulse quickened. This was exactly what she had come for, the hard proof that could bring Carlyle's empire crashing down. But it wasn't going to be easy. If Carlyle had a hidden room for his records, it would be heavily guarded, and getting in would require precise timing and coordination. "We're going to need more firepower," Jackson muttered. his voice laced with unease. He had clearly been shaken by the earlier firefight, and now the reality of what they were up against was starting to sink in. Rise nodded. I've stashed weapons nearby, but we don't have time to grab them. Carlisle's men are closing in on this area. We need to get to the server room before they do. Blake, still visibly fuming, turned to Angela. Chief, this is insane. We can't trust this guy. For all we know, he's leading us into a trap. Angela stared at Reyes, reading his body language, trying to gauge whether this was truly a lifeline or just another layer of Carlisle's twisted game. Her instincts told her Reyes was genuine, but this decision would not only affect her, it could mean life or death for all of them. She made her choice. We're going with him, Angela said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Blake's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious. I am, Angela snapped. You've had your turn to lead tonight, and look where it got us. Now you're going to follow my lead, and we're going to get what we came for. Blake bit back a retort, his face red with frustration, but he nodded begrudgingly. Jackson, still visibly shaken, offered no resistance. Rise motioned for them to follow him as he led them deeper into the mansion's labyrinth of hallways and hidden passages. As they moved swiftly but cautiously, Angela's mind raced. Carlisle was known for his ruthlessness, and she doubted he would go down without a fight. But this wasn't just about taking down one man anymore, it was about exposing the entire network of corruption that had allowed him to operate for so long. The walls around them seemed to close in as Reyes led them through a series of back passages, avoiding the main corridors where Carlisle's men were likely patrolling. Angela's senses were on high alert, every footstep echoing too loudly in the narrow, dimly lit spaces. We're close, Reyes whispered as they neared a heavy steel door at the end of a narrow corridor. Behind this door is the server room. Once we're in, we download everything and get out. Angela nodded, her eyes scanning the door for any signs of traps or alarms. What kind of security are we dealing with? Biometric lock, Reyes replied. Carlisle's men are the ones with access, but I've managed to bypass it before. Give me a few seconds. Angela gestured for Blake and Jackson to keep watch as Reyes knelt down in front of the panel next to the door, pulling out a small device from his jacket. His hands moved quickly, deftly working to override the security system. Angela crouched beside him, her eyes never leaving the hallway behind them. You've done this before, Angela murmured, her voice low. Reyes didn't look up, his focus entirely on the panel. Let's just say I've been in a few tight spots like this. Angela could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins, her mind racing as she considered the next steps. Once they had the evidence, getting out would be the real challenge. Carlisle wouldn't let them leave quietly, and Angela knew they were about to face even greater danger. The panel clicked, and Reyes stood up, pulling the heavy door open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The room beyond was cold and sterile, lit only by the glow of computer screens and the soft hum of server racks. It felt disconnected from the opulence of the rest of the mansion, a hidden nerve center where Carlisle's real power was stored. This is it, Reyes said, moving quickly to one of the terminals. Once I get into the system, it'll take a few minutes to download the files. We need to hold this position until then. Angela nodded, signaling to Blake and Jackson to cover the entrance. She could feel the tension rising again, the anticipation of what was to come. They were close, so close to taking Carlisle down, but that only made the situation more dangerous. Rye's fingers flew over the keyboard, the screens flashing as he accessed the server's core. It's encrypted, but I've got the key, he muttered, his focus intense. Just a few more seconds. Angela's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced toward the door. The silence in the hallway outside was unsettling, and she knew it wouldn't last. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from the corridor. "They're coming!" Blake shouted, drawing his gun as the sound of footsteps thundered toward them. Angela's pulse raced as she drew her own weapon, positioning herself behind the doorframe for cover. Jackson followed suit, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his gun. "We need more time," Rise called from the terminal, his voice tense. "I'm almost done." Angela didn't respond, her focus entirely on the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until finally, Carlyle's men burst into view, guns raised. The air exploded with gunfire as bullets ricocheted off the walls around them. "Hold them off," Angela shouted, firing back at the approaching men. Blake and Jackson returned fire, but they were outnumbered. More of Carlyle's enforcers flooded the hallway, and Angela could see that they were pinned down. There was no way they could hold this position for long. Rise frantically worked at the terminal, his fingers moving even faster as the download inched closer to completion. "Just a few more seconds," he yelled. Angela ducked as a bullet slammed into the wall above her head, the sharp smell of gunpowder filling the air. They were running out of time. The next few moments would decide everything, whether they walked out of this mansion with the evidence that could destroy Carlyle, or whether they were buried here, along with the truth. "Now or never, Reyes," Angela shouted over the gunfire. The terminal beeped, and Rise yanked the drive from the computer, shoving it into his jacket. "Got it?" he yelled. Angela didn't waste a second. "Fall back. We're getting out of here." Blake and Jackson fired a final round of shots before retreating, covering Rise as they moved back through the door and into the hallway. Angela was the last to move, her eyes scanning for any threats as they fled deeper into the mansion's labyrinth. But as they ran, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Carlyle's wasn't the type to let something like this go. He would come for them, and they had to be ready. The corridors of the mansion seemed to stretch on endlessly as Angela, Blake, Jackson, and Reyes sprinted through them, the sound of gunfire and shouting fading behind them, but never far enough to provide a sense of safety. Angela's heart pounded in her chest, her mind laser-focused on the mission at hand. They had the evidence now, but the hardest part was still ahead, escaping this nightmare alive. Blake was breathing heavily, his hand gripping his gun tightly as they moved. Jackson, though still visibly shaken, kept his composure, his eyes scanning every corner and shadow for the next threat. Rise led the way, moving swiftly and with purpose, but Angela could sense the growing tension in him. They were running out of time, and Carlyle wasn't the kind of man to let his prey escape so easily. As they rounded the corner toward the mansion's back exit, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted ahead of them. Angela's reflexes kicked in instantly. She ducked and pulled Blake and Jackson down with her behind a large stone pillar, while Reyes crouched low, signaling for them to hold their positions. "They've got the exits covered," Rise said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible over the ringing in their ears from the gunfire. "We need another way out." Angela's eyes darted around the space, assessing their options. The mansion was a fortress, and they had only seconds to act before Carlyle's men closed in on them. Her gaze fell on a narrow service corridor to their left, a dimly lit passage that led deeper into the bowels of the mansion. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but it was their only option. "This way," Angela called, motioning for the others to follow her as she darted into the corridor. Blake and Jackson followed without hesitation, their weapons raised and ready. Rise was right behind them, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being pursued. The service corridor was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on them as they moved quickly, the sounds of footsteps echoing unnervingly in the confined space. Angela's mind raced. They had to get outside and regroup, but the mansion was crawling with Carlyle's men. Every second they spent inside was another chance for them to be cornered. Rise moved ahead, his eyes scanning for any potential escape routes. "There's an old loading dock on the other side of the mansion," he said, his voice tense but steady. "It's rarely used. If we can get there, we might be able to find a vehicle and get out of here." Angela nodded, trusting Ray's knowledge of the building. She had no other choice. But as they neared the end of the corridor, Angela heard something that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pounding toward them from the other end. Carlyle's men had found them. "Move," Angela shouted, pushing the others forward as she turned to fire several shots down the hallway, buying them precious seconds. Blake and Jackson didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted ahead, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor as they reached a set of rusted metal doors. Rise grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door didn't budge. Locked. Ray's eyes hissed, his face contorted with frustration. Blake stepped forward, his jaw clenched as he aimed his gun at the lock. "Stand back." A single shot rang out, the lock shattering under the impact. Blake kicked the door open, and they rushed through, emerging into a wide loading area that was dimly lit by a flickering overhead light. But just as they thought they had a moment to breathe, Angela spotted movement out of the corner of her eye. More of Carlyle's men were closing in from the sides, their weapons raised. They had expected this exit. "There's too many of them," Jackson shouted, his voice strained with panic as he ducked behind a nearby stack of crates. Angela's mind raced. They were trapped, pinned down by gunfire with no clear way out. But then, in the distance, she saw a large, armored van parked near the far end of the dock. It was old, probably used for deliveries, but it was their only hope. "There." Angela pointed to the van. "We make a run for it. Cover me." Without waiting for a response, Angela bolted toward the van, her heart racing as bullets zipped past her, slamming into the concrete and metal around her. Blake and Jackson fired back, doing their best to suppress the attackers as Angela reached the vehicle. She wrenched the door open and climbed inside, quickly scanning the controls. It was an older model, but still functional. She ripped open the panel beneath the dashboard, using her tactical training to hotwire the engine. The van roared to life. "Get in!" Angela shouted over the noise of the engine, waving for the others to join her. Blake, Jackson, and Ray sprinted toward the van, bullets still flying around them. Jackson stumbled as he neared the van, clutching his arm, but Blake grabbed him and pulled him inside just as Angela hit the gas. The tires screeched as the van lurched forward, barreling toward the closed gates of the loading dock. Angela didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, the van crashing through the gates with a deafening sound of twisting metal. They sped out of the mansion's perimeter, the night air whipping through the open windows as they left the chaos behind. For a brief moment, Angela allowed herself to breathe, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. But she knew this wasn't over. Blake, still catching his breath, leaned forward from the passenger seat. "We've got the evidence. Now what?" Angela's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Now we go public. We take Carlyle down once and for all." But even as the words left her mouth, Angela knew that they had just survived one battle. Carlyle was a man with deep connections, a man who wouldn't go down easily. The evidence they had gathered was enough to destroy him, but only if they could get it into the right hands that hadn't already been corrupted by Carlyle's influence. Rise, sitting in the back, nodded grimly. We'll have to move fast. Carlyle's network runs deep. He's not going to sit back and wait for us to make our next move. He'll strike first. Angela knew he was right. This wasn't over. Carlyle would come for them, and when he did, it would be with the full force of his empire behind him. But Angela wasn't afraid. She had spent her entire career fighting men like Carlyle, men who thought they were untouchable, who thought they could manipulate the system to their advantage. But tonight, she had something Carlyle didn't expect: the truth. We'll be ready, Angela said, her voice filled with quiet determination. We've got what we need. Now it's time to finish this. As they sped through the darkened streets, leaving the mansion behind, Angela's mind was already working through the next steps. The evidence was secure, and soon Carlyle's world would come crashing down. But the real battle was just beginning. The city lights blurred as the van sped through the streets, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in their ears. Inside, the tension was palpable. Angela gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with everything that had transpired. Blake and Jackson sat in the back, catching their breath, while Reyes remained vigilant, watching for any signs that Carlyle's men might still be on their tail. The evidence they had secured was enough to bring down Carlyle, but Angela knew that their victory tonight was fragile. Carlyle wasn't just a man with wealth and influence, he had connections in law enforcement, the judiciary, and even politics. They needed to act fast before Carlyle could use those connections to cover his tracks or strike back. Angela pulled into a quiet side street and parked the van behind a row of abandoned warehouses. She turned off the engine, the sudden silence in the van contrasting sharply with the chaos they had just escaped. We can't go to the station, Blake said, breaking the silence. His voice was steadier now, though the tension was still there. Carlyle's got people in the department. We don't know who we can trust. Angela nodded, already thinking ahead. We'll take this straight to the federal task force. They've been working on Carlyle for months, and they're outside of his influence. They'll know what to do with the evidence. Reyes shifted in his seat, nodding in agreement. We have a safe house not far from here. It's secure. We can regroup there and plan our next move. Blake looked like he wanted to argue, but Angela's sharp glance silenced him. She wasn't in the mood for debates. The events of the night had pushed everyone to their limits, and they needed to focus. Carlyle would be mobilizing his resources as they spoke, and time wasn't on their side. The van moved again, this time heading toward the safe house Reyes had mentioned. The streets were quiet, but Angela knew better than to trust the calm. Carlyle's influence ran deep, and he would be using every resource at his disposal to track them down and erase the evidence they had collected. As they approached the safe house, a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, Angela's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a call from the police commissioner. Her pulse quickened. The commissioner was one of the few people she trusted in the department, but even then, she had learned to be cautious. Angela answered, her voice low. Commissioner? Chief Davis, came the commissioner's voice, strained but urgent. I just got word that Carlyle's men have infiltrated parts of the precinct. You can't bring anything there. We've got moles everywhere, and Carlyle's pulling strings to have this whole thing disappear. Angela's jaw clenched. I know. We're going to the federal task force. We have the evidence, but we're being hunted. The commissioner's silence spoke volumes. Then, finally, get that evidence to the feds. Carlisle's network is unraveling, but it's not going down without a fight. We'll do what we can to protect you on our end, but be careful. Carlisle still has friends in high places. Angela hung up and parked the van near the safe house. They moved quickly, entering the building in silence. Inside, the space was sparse but functional, an operations hub for covert agents, equipped with everything they'd need to finalize their plan. Rise immediately began uploading the evidence to a secure server, his fingers moving deftly over the keyboard. Angela, Blake, and Jackson stood nearby, their eyes scanning the room, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Once this is in the system, it's out of Carlisle's reach, Rise said, glancing back at them. There's no way he can erase this now. We've got him. Angela exhaled slowly, a weight lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet, but they had struck a blow, a decisive one. Carlisle's empire, built on years of corruption and violence, was crumbling. But Angela knew that Carlisle wouldn't go down without a fight. He would try to strike back, and hard. The only question was when and how. Blake crossed his arms, his face still etched with the tension of the night's events. So what now? Carlisle isn't just going to sit back and let this happen. Angela looked at him, her expression firm. We stay ready. The feds will handle the next steps, but we can't let our guard down. Carlisle will come for us, he has to. We've disrupted everything he's built. Jackson, who had been quiet for most of the drive, finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. Do you think we'll be able to stop him? For good. Angela met his gaze, and for a moment the weight of the entire night seemed to hang between them. She knew what Jackson was really asking. Carlisle was one man, but his influence was far-reaching, and systems built on corruption didn't collapse overnight. I don't know, Angela admitted, but tonight we hit him where it hurts. We've taken away his power, exposed his network. That's more than anyone's managed to do so far. Jackson nodded, though his expression was still troubled. The reality of what they had been up against was settling in, and the understanding that this wasn't the end but just the beginning was hard to swallow. Rise finished uploading the files and turned to face them. The evidence is secure. Carlisle's going to have a lot of explaining to do when this hits the light of day. But you're right, he's not going down without a fight. Angela glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight, and the city outside was quiet, but beneath the surface, she knew the storm was just beginning to brew. Carlisle would retaliate, she was certain of that. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had survived the night, and they had the truth on their side. We'll be ready, Angela said again, her voice steady. Whatever Carlisle throws at us next, we'll be ready. As they stood there in the safe house, the weight of the night's events still fresh in their minds, Angela couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. They had survived. They had the evidence, and Carlisle's empire was about to crumble. But deep down, she knew the real fight was just beginning.